Hi, this is Diana, and today I'll be presenting small-scale composting. Now, this is specifically for the home and community garden. I'm presenting on behalf of Urban Harvest. Now, Urban Harvest is a nonprofit here in Houston, Texas, where we're looking to make the world a better place by providing community garden programming, hosting local farmers markets, and offering youth education classes and programs. Now, before we get started, let's define some of the terms I'm going to be using. Many of these have definitions that overlap, so that we're on the same page. I'd like to kind of give you the definitions that I will be using. First of all, mulch. Mulch is any material, organic or inorganic, used to cover soil. Its main purpose is to conserve water, moderate soil temperatures, and suppress weeds. Now, for the purposes of my lecture, I'm going to talk about organic materials, things like tree limbs and leaves, anything that was once living. In general, it can be inorganic materials like stones and rocks, but we're not going to talk about them. Compost. If you do an online search for compost, define compost, you're going to get definitions that are extremely basic all the way to very complex. A lot of this has to do with the fact that there are people who get their doctorates on compost. So just know that I'm going to go with a very basic definition of organic matter that is decomposed and provides nutrients. Now, when it goes into further decomposition, it is called humus. Now, this organic matter is so decomposed that the cell structure isn't even, when you look under a microscope, you can no longer tell what it was. It has no structure, and that's why a lot of the definitions for humus will have the word amorphous, so structureless. And actually, under a microscope, I haven't seen it, but I've been told it is jelly-like substance. So, yeah, you can't tell what it was that got decomposed. It's extremely good for soil. But today I'm going to focus on compost. Now, kind of to better illustrate the idea, imagine the forest floor, which is often what you're going to want to replicate in your perennial gardens or your vegetable gardens, any of your gardens, even an orchard. But mulch is going to be that topmost layer, kind of like what we're looking at in this picture, where you can identify what you're looking at. I see leaves and various forms of decomposition. I see twigs and grasses. I see the previous season annuals kind of dying off. It's very easy to tell what's going on. Now, if you just scratch the surface, you're going to start seeing, and this is in a healthy forest and established forest system, you're going to start seeing compost. And compost is more uniform in nature. It'll be very broken down. I mean, you can occasionally see little bits of leaves and so forth, but mostly what you're going to see is something more uniform and very earthy smelling. And actually that earthiness comes from the actinomycetes. Now, once you kind of dig a little further down, and I'm talking maybe an inch, when you kind of hit the soil level, soil is going to have humus integrated with it, and it's going to be really hard to, you can't really just say, oh, this is humus right here. It just know that it's down there and it's part of the soil and it's not easily defined, but that it's there and it's extremely important. Now, why compost? Why is it so important? Well, it creates a biologically active soil, and it does this by providing food to microorganisms, specifically beneficial microorganisms. Now, other things that compost does is it breaks up clay. Whenever you add organic matter to very heavy clay soil, clay is like, imagine a stack of plates or even paper. Imagine paper, they're little sheets. And so anytime you add organic matter, you're actually helping to create pores and openings. And so it helps to break up that clay. Alternately, it helps to improve sandy soils by increasing its water holding capacity. Sandy soil has the opposite problem. It's like, if you look at it under a dissecting scope, looks like giant boulders or rocks, and it has these huge openings. And so by putting organic matter in those openings, it helps it to hold water, which obviously is very important to plants, most plants. As compost breaks down further, it turns into humus and gets incorporated into the soil, which is excellent. Another thing that it does that people often don't think about it is that it improves disease resistance in plants. And the way it does that is very much, remember, plant is a living thing, just like you and I are living things. And when we're stressed, sleep deprived, have a horrible diet, our immune systems are usually also affected. And we tend to get sick easier, we have a harder time of it. Plants are the same way. If they have heat stress, they are malnourished, they are on the dry side, or whatever. If they've got physical stressors, they're going to be more apt to catch various pathogens or be affected by insect pests. Now, when we're talking about biologically active soils, this is what I mean by biologically active soil. We've got the organic matter that is feeding bacteria and fungi and nematodes and even snails, although they're not represented on this list. And then from there, those are our primary consumers. And then you've got your predatory nematodes, your arthropods. You have basically this whole ecosystem going on underground where everyone is eating everyone. And this is a biologically active soil, and we don't often see a lot of what's going on underground. So we think of it as inert. So more specifically, what are the microorganisms, the beneficial microorganisms in our compost? Now, the primary one, and the one that often starts the process when you first start a compost pile, is going to be the bacteria. They have the highest number. Just a reminder that bacteria and all these guys I mentioned, they have counterparts that are not beneficial, but for the most part, they are. And bacteria starts off the work even when temperatures are about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So they don't need it to be super hot. And so they have the highest numbers. And then it gets followed up by actinomycetes, which in some literature is written as actinobacteria. They used to think that it was a fungi because it kind of looks and acts just like a fungi, but it is technically a bacteria. So it's kind of in between, but it eats up lignin and chitin. It's a pretty hard worker. And then fungi does the same thing. It breaks these really difficult to break down plant parts like lignin and chitin. The last one I'm going to talk about is protozoa. Protozoa, unicellular animals, they're kind of your support people. They're never going to be the star of the show. They're there and they're helping out. They're doing their part. But I thought it was important to mention them because we usually hear negative things about protozoans. Now, invertebrates. Like I said, some of the invertebrates are also primary consumers. They're eating plant material and then themselves are getting eaten by others. But the number one invertebrate that we have in our soils is actually one that we can't see with our naked eye, and those are the nematodes. There's so many nematodes. Some of them are herbivorous, some of them are carnivorous, but they're all doing a lot of work. There's also mites and springtails, but most importantly, there are earthworms. Now, earthworms produce some of the most expensive and desirable compost out there. What they do is they pretty much consume all these kitchen scraps, all this organic matter, and what they release is some of the best compost that you can put in your garden. And they also have a tendency to aerate the soil, which is, we will find out when we talk about both the chemistry and the physics of compost, is extremely important for a composting system. So they're actually creating aeration tunnels and making sure that oxygen gets to your compost pile, in addition to making really excellent compost. So let's talk about compost physics. And I know it sounds a little, there's no test at the end of this. It helps to understand how things work when you're trying to problem solve. Why is my compost not decomposing? Or why does my compost smell so bad? You know, all these problems, if you understand what you're going for and how it works, it's a lot easier to go, oh, I need to turn my pile, it's gone anaerobic, or my pile is too cold, there's not, you know, the pieces are too large, whatever. It helps to understand how it should work. So temperature. Now, people will often talk about, oh, there's the three phases. It's mesophilic, thermophilic, and then the maturation phase. All you really need to know is that when you first start your compost pile, it's warm. You know, it's nice beach temperature, 68 degrees, and that's when you have the bacteria going. And then once it really amps up and gears up, it's going into something called a thermophilic phase, which is really hot. You're talking about 100 to 140 degrees. This is really important and is part of what makes this compost, but it kills off anything, any of the bad any pathogens that you have in your pile, or even weed seeds that you have in your pile. It will kill them off once you hit that 140-degree temperature. Now, what happens after a while is that your microbes will consume all of the nitrogen in that soil, and once that happens, no matter how much you turn it, it's done. And so you hit the maturation phase, which is, you know, a little warmer than the mesophilic phase, but not much. It's definitely something you can put your hand in and not get burned. Now, a thing of note, if it goes over 149 degrees, that's death for everybody. That's not, you know, that's going to kill your beneficial and your pathogenic microorganisms. Now, particle size. The smaller the particle, the greater the surface area, which is important because the more surface area you have, the more of an area you have for microbes to come in and break things down, which means faster decomposition. So if you've in the past had problems with your compost pile moving very slowly and not breaking down, you might consider, you know, if you have leaves, maybe mowing them down before you put them in your pile, or if you're using limbs, maybe cutting them into smaller pieces. You know, there's different things you can do, but you're wanting to increase surface area. So lots of times it means whatever you're putting in there, you should break it down. Aeration, aka oxygen. We are talking about aerobic systems. Now, there are anaerobic compost systems, and most of the time you're seeing that in commercial use, very large scale operations. We're talking about community gardens and backyards, so something a lot smaller. So we're talking about aerobic systems, which means that aerobic microorganisms need oxygen, and they can, just like we do, they consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide. Now, if you are under a big pile, as you can tell, you're going to have a lot less oxygen. Our atmosphere sits at about 21% oxygen, whereas inside of a pile, you're looking at something closer to 10 to 15%. And those microorganisms are going to consume that oxygen. And so you want to make sure that there's a way for more oxygen to get into the pile, because otherwise the system will go anaerobic and then they will die. Basically, they stop breathing because there's nothing to breathe. Anything below 5% is deemed anaerobic. And so that is not what we want. Moisture content, imagine a damp sponge. We want about a 50% moisture content, more or less. You know, you can go up to 60, that's fine. But 50% is kind of our ideal range. If it goes to less than 30, it's too dry, and you're gonna have really slow decomposition because, you know, our microorganisms need moisture. Now, above 65%, it's gonna go anaerobic. It's too wet. Which here in Houston, Texas, sometimes that can happen in a day, which is why we recommend that you cover compost piles down here to kind of so that you can control how much moisture is getting into your pile. Another thing that's important is the size of your system. You need it to be big enough that it can retain heat and moisture, but also small enough that you can manage it and actually, add, increase circulation. Basically, you get a pitchfork and you turn it. There's other things that you can use to turn it, but mostly you're wanting to be able to make sure that the center of your pile gets oxygen. Now let's talk a little bit about what size is ideal for the backyard gardener or community garden, and what kind of structures that we can use. You don't actually need a framed structure. You can have a static pile. There are grad students that have had to do studies on this where they have a static pile next to a bin, and the rate of decomposition was the same. It didn't really make a difference. So mostly it's for aesthetic value and also to kind of minimize your footprint a bit. It's a little easier to walk around a bin than it is to walk around a pile for some people. Or if you have a homeowners association, lots of times they would prefer you do things in bins. So materials that you can use for framing a compost pile, pretty much anything. I'm not a fan of pallets personally because, well, I'm not a fan of pallets. If they aren't treated, they have a tendency to kind of break down and rot, and then you can end up with nails and other things or screws uh, into your compost pile. And I don't, and that as it's breaking down doesn't look that great as a structure. Uh, and if they're treated, they may be adding other things to your chemicals to your pile. But, lumber, untreated lumber, things like cedar works really well. But once again, will be temporary here in the very hot, humid Gulf Coast. I like concrete blocks, but not everyone is a fan. Metal fencing, now here you're going to have the problem of vines climbing up, and some people recommend hay bales. So those are some different options. This is what you need to keep in mind. Imagine a 4x4 footprint. That's about the size that you're going for. That's about 3 to 4 feet high. It might actually be that it's 4 feet high when you first start off, because as soon as you add moisture to it, it'll collapse down some. Keep it away from structures. I've seen so many times where people put it up against a house or against a shed. The problem with that is that if you have brick, of course, it's going to stain your brick, but more importantly, it's going to want to attract termites. And, termites in your compost pile, sure, that's fine, but, termites getting into your house that is framed with wood, or your shed, or your garage, that's not so great. So keep it 3 feet away from structures. It could be in the sun or shade. When I first started out, I, for some reason, thought that my compost pile had to be in the sun for it to be hot enough and break down. And actually what happened, it kept drying out because I wasn't managing it very well. So it doesn't matter where you site it. It can be in the sun or shade. Just, if it's an area where you're not planning to put a garden in, maybe that's a good place to put a compost pile. As your garden matures, you might want to add a second bin. Say you have, a half acre, or, maybe it's something a little bigger than a quarter acre because you're on a corner lot. Over time, you might want to add a second bin, a second pile. But when you start off, just start off small so that you can master it before you move further. So here's piles. Rodell's book has a static pile with a pitchfork. That's, it's as easy as it is. Here's a kind of, do it yourself, structured pile with cinder blocks. Like I said, I personally tend to prefer that, but that has to do with my cultural practices. Everyone's different, and so different things will work for different people. Here's one that's from Johnny Seeds, one that you can purchase, and it's a 4x4 structure. And as you can see, it looks very neat and tidy. And because of the fencing material, it will allow for air circulation. Now, if you live in a condo, like an apartment with a little patio, or even a townhouse with a little courtyard, you may not have the space for a 4x4 pile. There are tiny systems that you can use. There's those tumblers that you see advertised in magazines, or those rigid earth ovens, I think they're called something like that. They're just this extremely tough plastic bin that sits about 3 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide. Online, you're going to see a lot of these, or on Pinterest, you're going to see a lot of these do-it-yourself systems where you just buy a plastic bin. The problem with that in places like Houston is that many of those bins aren't designed to hold hot, wet materials in our summer sun, and so they tend to degrade after about 2 years, which isn't the most environmentally friendly thing to do. Bokashi systems are interesting, especially for those of you who like fermenting anyway. This is something that you can keep in your kitchen. It's anaerobic. It's the only anaerobic system I'm going to mention, but it uses fermentation. So you can put kitchen scraps in there, and if you're doing it, and it uses lactobacillus as its main bacteria, as its main microorganism. So that's very neat. And then there's vermicomposting. So the picture over here to the left is actually a vermicomposting system. You kind of have to treat them like pets. All of these systems are going to require a lot more maintenance, a lot more of your time, because they're smaller systems. If the system is very small or very large, it's going to take a lot more of your time. But it's kind of fun if you have kids, or if you teach classes, to have this little vermicomposting system. Now, compost chemistry. One of the most intimidating parts of composting is that carbon to nitrogen ratio, which unfortunately is extremely important. I decided not to put a carbon to nitrogen ratio chart here. I'm going to try to keep it simple and not intimidate you, but you should know this. So our ideal ratio is going to be 30 to 1. So 30 to 1 as in carbon to nitrogen. So we're going to always want a little more carbon. The thing is, anything that has been living, that's organic, has a carbon to nitrogen ratio. So when you're looking at things we like to call your green materials, your green composting materials, most of them will have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So kitchen scraps sit at about 15 to 1, whereas sawdust, your brown material, is going to be 500 to 1. So you want to make sure, when you're, once again, trying to figure out why on earth your compost pile isn't decomposing, well, if it's primarily sawdust, then it's going to take a long time for it to decompose. Whereas if it's really hot and tends to get stinky really fast, and you feel like you can't manage it, it might be that you have too much green material. You're putting too many grass clippings and kitchen scraps in it. And so that's why it's important to kind of work on that ratio. But don't get caught up on it, because we have a little formula to kind of get you through it, at least, hopefully it makes it easier. Oxygen, once again, very important. Greater than 10% is optimal. Less than 5% is anaerobic. So, you really do need that oxygen in there. pH. Now, I haven't talked about pH, but you really shouldn't have to worry too much about pH here. It's pretty forgiving, 5.5 to 8.5. Anything below 4.5 is going to be too acidic. So basically, you're going to burn your little organisms at that point. It's just too acidic. But for the most part, you shouldn't have to worry about that. Other nutrients, I just mentioned them. I know carbon and nitrogen are the most important, but there are other things that are important. But usually you're getting that with the materials that you're adding to your pile. So let's talk about the green materials we're going to add. Just kind of as an aside, nitrogen functions as protein for your microorganisms, and your brown material, the carbon often functions as the carbohydrate. And so that's why another reason why we need certain ratios for them and why they're so important. Anything green and moist is usually going to be the thing that provides nitrogen. So kitchen scraps, vegetable scraps from when, you harvest cauliflower. It's this huge plant and you're not usually eating the leaves, you're just eating the cauliflower part. And so all that material can be cut and put in your compost pile. Grass clippings, assuming that you do that. And then coffee grounds and tea bags are always something that kind of go in with your kitchen scraps. Brown materials. So this is anything basically. If it's brown and woody and dry looking, more than likely it's going to be considered a high carbon item. Diversity of tree leaves. I know a lot of people get caught up on, oh, don't use pecan leaves because they're allelopathic. Well, if you've got them mixed in with oak and pine and ash and all these other leaves, then it shouldn't be a problem. It's when you're using something that's exclusively pecan, then you're going to have a problem. So always go for diversity. Small twigs, trimmed stems, anything that, when you think about diameter, if it can be cut with loppers or bypass pruners, then it's fine. Just cut it up, throw it in there. Dried grasses, hay, also newspaper, so long as you don't use the glossy inserts. Anything that looks like a magazine, do not use. But if it's newsprint, even if it has color in it, you can just shred it and throw it in there. So those are some items that are brown materials. So getting the mix started. A way to go around the whole carbon to nitrogen ratio and having to learn how much of each you need is just to use the simple formula. Now, layering is not required. This is just something to make it easy when you're getting started. You're still going to have to mix it, or you're going to want to mix it if you want to speed up decomposition. But start off with 6 inches of your brown material. So imagine half of a ruler. That's how you want to layer this 4x4 area. Once you've got that down, add 2 inches of your green material. So your kitchen scraps, or, as you clean up your vegetable garden, anything that was left over, there's your green material. You want to put ground soil, or if you have compost from another system, you can put that in there. And what you're doing is you're inoculating your pile so that you're introducing those beneficial organisms to it. They do also come up from the soil, but it's really nice when you get them in there just right off the start. And then you just repeat the layers, and you end with the brown layer, and it's because you always want to cover anything green. So if you have kitchen scraps sitting on the top of your pile, it's going to be a lot more attractive to pests. So you always, and also it can get smelly. So you always want to put a layer of brown to cover that up. As you water it, it doesn't have to be soaked through. Remember, you're looking for that 50% damp sponge consistency. So here's a few tips. Start small. And that's with anything, with any project. When you're first learning, start small. Failure is how we learn, and it'd be better to have small failures than really big ones that cost you a lot of money. Cut materials. Always try to shred or cut materials that you're adding to your pile. The smaller, remember, increased surface area means faster rate of decomposition. Air, oxygen, also speeds up decomposition. So turn your pile if you can, or introduce, make sure that you're encouraging earthworms. You don't have to introduce them most of the time. They'll come up from the soil, but if they don't seem to, then maybe you can. Moisture. Remember, moisture is important. Don't let it dry out. If the pile is too small, it's going to have a tendency to dry out very quickly and get cold, meaning there's very little going on in it. If it's too large, the very center can go anaerobic because it's not getting any oxygen. It also can tend to get pretty warm in there. And like I said before, here near the Gulf Coast, you'll want to make sure you have a roof. Now, if you have a static pile, maybe it's a tarp or something that you lay on top of it. If it's a 4x4 bin, pretty easy. You can use plywood or metal sheeting to cover it up. Now, things to avoid: don't let your pile get too big, especially in the beginning. Don't add things like meat and dairy products because you're going to start attracting pests. Also, that's more, I mean, those things can be composted, definitely, if you're an advanced person and you know what you're doing. But for the most part, don't add meat and dairy products. You know, don't leave things exposed. We just talked about covering things up. You don't want to overwater your pile because can make it anaerobic. And try to avoid some manures. I know, like, if you have a composting toilet, you're out living in the land, that's fine. You can, there's whole books. There's a book called Humanure that will teach you all the things that you need to do in order to avoid pathogens like E. coli. But as a beginner, just stick to garden waste and leaves and twigs and stuff. So I added this table. It's actually from the Cornell Waste Management Institute. It's just for you to look at. We've talked about all these things, but when you notice there's problems with your pile, you might want to look at this list. Something I like to tell everybody, this is a picture I took from the Fort Worth Japanese gardens, but don't let the best be the enemy of the good. Lots of times we're so caught up in trying to do it perfectly or just right and not make any mistakes, and then we don't even start because we get anxious and don't even bother to start. Mistakes is how we learn. Failure is part of learning, and so you want to allow you should get started and be forgiving and try to learn from your mistakes. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and good luck.